Okay, good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to UIW. This is our Sabbath morning scripture study. Thank you so very much for joining us today. I hope it is beautiful where you are. It's a little cloudy here, but it's a lovely day, so Shabbat Shalom. We are presently in an ongoing study that I've called Prophet. A study called Prophet. Today's class is number 10 in the series, of which I don't have a particular end in sight. So I don't know how long we'll go on this, perhaps another 4 or 5 years, perhaps another week, who knows. But I am excited about what we're doing, and I think that these classes are beneficial, and I look forward every week to sharing what I come up with all of you. I want to use our time together today to go a little bit further on what we began last week. Last week I started a study within the Prophet series on redemptive figures. And notice that I say figures as in plural. I wanted to show last week, by way of introduction, that I wanted to share a little bit about Messiah and the Messianic age, and this prevalent idea among what I call the people of the book. And when I say the people of the book, obviously I'm talking about this book, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and the people of the book would be Christians, Jews, B'nai Noah, anyone who is Hebraically oriented, anyone who looks to the Hebrew Bible for their inspiration and as their guide to a wholesome way of life. Most people who are people of the book look at this subject of the Messiah, and when they think about this end times, they think of a chief eschatological figure, a singular coming Messiah who is going to usher humanity from our current place into what is typically known as the age to come. So that's the worldview of most people of the book, that this chief eschatological figure is called the Messiah. Now, what I tried to stress last week was basically to introduce a question mark to that part. In other words, of course, the Bible talks about the current age and the age to come, no doubt. There are plenty of references which describe in some way, in some detail, what that age to come will look like, no doubt. My question is it biblically accurate, is it biblically correct to call the one who is to bring us from this age to the next age, is it proper and biblically correct to call that one the Messiah? And furthermore, is it a singular eschatological figure that's going to accomplish that, as is generally believed, or is it more than one figure? Thus, my title, if you will, the redemptive figures, plural. Many passages in the Hebrew Bible do provide us with pictures, with glimpses, with descriptions of this coming glorious age, often referred to as the Messianic age, or sometimes as the days of the Messiah. Again, I'm prepping, I'm setting up for today's teaching. So the question is that an accurate way to depict the coming age, the Messianic age? The rabbis say in Sanhedrin 99a, all the prophets prophesied not, but of the days of the Messiah. In other words, every one of these pictures and descriptions which talk about this glorious coming age, the rabbis would categorically call those the days of the Messiah. So the question is that right? And then many of the passages in the Hebrew Bible provide us with pictures or descriptions of an eschatological figure. The question I have is it biblically correct to call this figure the Messiah. As the Sanhedrin 98b reference in the Talmud said, the world was not created but for the Messiah, you see. So by the time you get into the development of both Judaism and Christianity, people have ascertained, have determined from this literature that there is a singular end times figure called the Messiah who ushers in. Now, please know that my intention in drawing out some distinction here is not for the purpose of finding fault. This is not a negative enterprise. I'm not trying to poke fun at or to correct or to overcorrect what other people believe. That's not my intention, but rather to clarify. So everything that I do, everything that I study, I want my beliefs to accurately align with the understanding that comes strictly from the text, okay? I want to search for answers to questions that are raised by the text. And I know that a lot of people have this in their mind at least already figured out. So they've already identified. Not only have many people in their mind identified that this chief redemptive figure is called the Messiah, but many, not just in our day and not since just 2,000 years ago, but throughout history, people have identified the identity of that one. Whether it's Shabbatai Tzvi, whether it's Jesus of Nazareth, whether it's Menachem Schneerson, people have identified in their best understanding of the text who this person is, or possibly who it will be. So again, I'm not trying to be the person who rains on the parade or the person who finds fault with these beliefs. I'm not even interested in those solutions. What I'm more interested in is looking directly at the text and seeing what does it say. People can understand it the way they want to if it fits within the text as far as I'm concerned, but I want to start with the text. Now, I'm really interested in the words of the prophets concerning this ushering in and the figures that will bring that about, particularly the words of the prophets. And why would I be interested in what they have to say? We're going to begin this morning in Deuteronomy 18, just to make the point. I think everyone knows this text quite well, especially by now, given our current series. But in Deuteronomy 18:18, it says, I will raise them up, a prophet from among their brethren like you, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. So the stress in this is that when the prophet speaks, he is speaking the words, not his own words, but the words of the one who sent him, which is, according to the biblical narratives, Jehovah. So if we're looking for the words of Jehovah, we ought to be looking at the words of the prophets who are the spokesperson for Jehovah. And the reason that we're interested in what Jehovah said is because, as it puts it in Deuteronomy 8, Moses so eloquently says that man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes forth from the mouth of Jehovah. So these words that we're looking at for our inspiration, for our understanding, these words are nourishment for us because they're food, they're spiritual food, if you will. So every word that proceeds or goes forth from the mouth of Jehovah, in Hebrew, Pe Yehovah, it's used dozens of times. The greater part of biblical history, what comes forth from the mouth of Jehovah is to be found on the lips and in the hands of the prophets. What do I mean the hands of? Meaning that they many times will record in writing the very words of Jehovah. That's why it's so important to understand the prophets. Go with me this morning to the book of Amos. To the book of Amos and chapter 3, just giving a little bit of foundation before we proceed this morning. In Amos chapter 3, verse 3, can two walk together unless they be agreed? Will a lion roar in the forest when there is no prey? Will a young lion cry out of his den if he's taken nothing? Can a bird fall in a snare upon the earth where there is no lure for it? Does a snare spring up from the earth and have taken nothing at all? Shall a shofar be sounded in the city and the people not be afraid? Shall evil befall a city and Jehovah has not done it? Surely Adonai Jehovah will do nothing without revealing his secret to his servants, the prophets. The lion has roared, who will not fear? Jehovah, Elohim, has spoken, who can but prophesy? The indication here, according to Amos, is that Jehovah is going to speak through his prophet and announce things ahead of time. And unless he announces it through a prophet, according to his own word, here through Amos, nothing will happen. It's always going to be preceded, his work is always going to be preceded by an announcement from the prophets. Test. Okay. Do a quick sound check. Let me know you can hear me. Should be good. Is that meter moving? Yeah. Okay, back on. All right, so my point before my battery died, and by the way, I checked and it showed 100%, but then just like that. So we're back. I have a whole case of them. We're good. Thank you for letting me know that. Amos chapter 3 and verse 7 particularly says that God does nothing unless he reveals his secret to his servants, the prophets. And then after that, I made the point that we cannot add to or take away from the words of Jehovah. So Deuteronomy chapter 4:2, Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 32, or 13, verse 1, whether you're reading Hebrew or English, both of which warn us, saying that in order to guard the words, we must resist adding to or taking away from the word which Jehovah has spoken. Proverbs 30 and verse 6 says that if we add to God's word, we'll be considered a liar. So I take this very seriously. And by that I mean that whenever I look at Scripture, I want to stay as close to what the Scripture says, because I believe that particularly when I'm dealing with that which comes forth from the mouth of Jehovah, it's incumbent on us to guard that word. I think that is one of the greatest crimes. In fact, it appears to be one of the first crimes of humanity. If you go back to the garden, when Eve adds to the word, it brings about great problems, as we know from reading the biblical story. So we want to keep to the text. And the reason I take this so seriously is because I want to base my understanding of Scripture on these words. I don't want to bring in, no matter who it is, whether it's a person of great learning who has other ideas which aren't scriptural, I want to stick with the text. I want to call Bible things by Bible names. And so whenever someone says, they begin to describe some of these messianic passages, as they are called. Notice air quotes, messianic passages. And they'll say, this is talking about the coming of the Messiah. I want to see if it mentions the Messiah in that text. You can say, well, you have to, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. You know, it's a way, how do we get to calling these redemptive texts, how do we get to assign the person with that the Scripture is talking about, how do we get to assign that title, the Messiah? If it doesn't say it in Scripture, then we ought to call it by what it's called. So some might think I'm making a mountain out of a molehill, but what I want you to understand is I'm being as literal as I can, and I want to carefully understand things according to what the texts say. Now, where associations can be made by similar words or phrases, where we can pull different descriptions together, that's acceptable. That's good. We want to do that. We want to look for clues in these texts which associate this section of the prophets with this section of the prophets. And by doing so, we can expand the vision. We can begin to understand a little bit more about the context by connecting the dots, if you will. Now, a couple of examples. One of the things that we covered a couple of weeks ago, but just to touch on it, and I'm giving a little bit of groundwork because you'll see that it becomes necessary. In Isaiah chapter 40 and in Malachi chapter 3, when I talked about the messenger, in Malachi chapter 3, clearly the description is about a messenger who will panuderek, prepare the way. All right, you remember that in Malachi chapter 3, verse 1? So one of the ways that we connect and get a bigger picture and get a deeper understanding is by looking for phrases that are like. So in Malachi chapter 3, the messenger is the one who prepares the way. The messenger is the one whose task it is to prepare the way before Jehovah. If you go to Isaiah chapter 40, that opening section which begins, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, comfort ye my people, we enter into this prophetic end times picture that Deutero-Isaiah paints so vividly for us. One of the things that it mentions in Isaiah 40 is the preparation of the way. Now, in Isaiah chapter 40, there's no mention of messenger. It doesn't say messenger, but we know in Isaiah chapter 40 that because it mentions prepare the way, that it should be brought together with Malachi chapter 3 for a better understanding. Now, further in that study, we looked at Isaiah chapter 57, verse 14, which also talks about preparing the way. Same Hebrew phrase. So, as I tried to illustrate at that point, I'm now looking at Malachi chapter 3, verse 1, and the context around it. I'm including Isaiah chapter 40 and the context around it. I'm looking at Isaiah chapter 57, verse 14, and Isaiah 62, verse 10. You pull all those together, and what I'll do is I'll often make charts on paper. Okay, here's what we know about the messenger in Malachi 3. Here's what we know about the voice, and that way you get a full picture. All right. Last week I touched on a couple of passages which people have often read and considered, but which they may not quite interpret correctly. The example that I gave from Daniel chapter 7 was the Son of Man who is coming on the clouds of heaven. Jews, Christians, people of the book have associated Daniel chapter 7 with a singular coming on the clouds Messiah. It's covered in the Talmud. It's covered in Christian writings. People have always looked at Daniel 7, the majority of people, as a messianic figure coming on the clouds. But in Daniel chapter 7, the interpretation is given, and that's not what it's talking about. We illustrated that. We touched on Genesis 49. We touched on various prophetic things from that chapter. We touched on Numbers chapter 24, verse 17, the scepter and the star. We talked about in Micah 5, the ruler of Bethlehem Ephratah. So we've covered a lot of material so far just in an opening class last week on redemptive figures. Now I'm going to begin building off of that, and I want you to follow closely as we get into the text today, because we're going to take things a little bit further. We're going to begin to look at more details, and over the next several weeks I want to expand this such that we begin to bring in material from various prophetic sections, and it will better help us to nail down the identity of this one who is coming, a last one who will arise upon the dust. And that's going to be probably in the next class. So you gotta think about that. So anyway, Shabbat Shalom. No, I'm just joking. Last week, one of the things that I did, though, I took Genesis 49, and Genesis 49 begins with Jacob calling his sons together. Gather yourselves together that I may tell you that which shall befall you ba'akarit hayamim, in the latter days. And then he goes through and he begins to pronounce certain prophetic utterances, if you will, over the names, over the tribes, his descendants. We talked about Shiloh, Ad ki yavo Shiloh, until Shiloh comes. And then in this is where I'm going to spring into today's class. In Genesis 49:24, there is mention of a shepherd stone from Joseph. In the blessing of Joseph, it uses a phrase, Misham roe even Israel. From there, a shepherd stone of Israel. Last week, I kind of focused on the shepherd. I talked about the significance, the biblical significance associated with the prophetic redemptive figures known with the shepherd. That brought us into Micah 5 and so forth. Remember in Micah 5 it says, and he shall stand and shepherd. See, so this ruler of Beit Lechem Ephratah is a shepherd, if you will. Is that the shepherd of Genesis 49:24? I don't know. And what is this reference to a stone? I think this is very important. The stone is a word that's used in several biblical prophetic passages. And I want to ask the question as we get into the material today on the stone initially, is the stone a hint at the identity of the prophetic figure which is to come and usher in the end of days? In other words, some of the texts which are categorically called messianic mention a stone, seemingly referring to a person, okay? So I want to look this morning with that introduction. I'd like you to go with me to Psalm 118, Psalm 118 and verse 22. Psalm 118, verse 22. The stone which the builders rejected has become the headstone of the corner. The stone which the builders rejected has become the headstone or the cornerstone. Now, one of the things that I want to point out is it doesn't say the stone. In the Hebrew it says a stone. All right, so a stone, Evan Ma'asu Habonim. A stone which the builders rejected has become for a Rosh Pinah, which is typically translated a cornerstone. A cornerstone, Rosh Pinah, Rosh means head, so you can hear in this translation it's trying to pull that in, head of the corner. Pinah is tied to the idea of a turn or a face. Like if I turn to face you, see, it's Pinah. So the idea is that a cornerstone would be at a place of turning, a structural part of the building, a place for the turning. So and it's very important. If you get the cornerstone wrong, then the building's going to be off, you see. So it's very important. So the idea is that which is the foundation has been rejected by the builders. Now, why would the builders reject a cornerstone? Can you imagine? People who know how to build, a cornerstone is put into place, and for whatever reason, it's rejected. Now, just leave that with you just to ponder. We're going to go back and fill in some details in future classes. But the idea that Psalm 118:22 is suggesting is that the very foundation of the building is rejected by the builders. Now, what does that even mean? Is this in any way pointing towards a redemptive figure? I mean, Genesis 49:24 mentions an Evid, an Evan, a stone, but a shepherd's stone, a Roe Evan. What does that even mean, see? So already, but these are both considered messianic passages. They are considered to be pointing towards this eschatological figure. Who is this rejected stone? And what builders are we talking about that rejected the stone? We don't get a lot from the context. If you read the context around it, understanding that this is clearly poetic, but the question is, does this look to another who is to come that would be rejected? Very interesting to consider. All those who've come before us, many of which have taken this to be referring to a coming one. Now go with me with this thought in mind to go to Isaiah 28. Go with me to Isaiah 28. And let's look at another passage about the stone. Isaiah 28 and verse 16. You'll notice I'm not reading the entire context, but I want to make a point here. It says in Isaiah 28:16, "Therefore thus says Adonai Yehovah, behold, I lay in Zion for a foundation, a stone, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation. He that believes shall not make haste." Interesting. All right, now first of all, I'll let you know that this particular portion of text in the prophet Isaiah begins in Isaiah 28, verse 16. The white space is right before verse 16, and it picks up. Lachen ko amar Adonai Yehovah. He says, just sort of out of the blue, when you look at this in Hebrew, he says, "Therefore," which tells us something prior is important, but we're not going to look at that yet. Stick with me. We just get this announcement abruptly about Jehovah. Adonai Jehovah is putting in Zion an Evan, a stone. He's establishing in Zion a stone, an Evan Bohan Pinah. Now, Pinah is this same word that is translated cornerstone, attested. Whoever this stone is, assuming that this stone is a redemptive figure, will be greatly tested. Right? What does that mean? I don't know. What else do we have? It's a precious, in Hebrew, yakar means precious or rare. It's a precious or rare foundation, and then we have to wonder what else is around this that can provide us with clues. But I want to keep going. What I want you to think about this. I could dig a hole very wide and shallow. What I'm doing with you this morning is going... I didn't get that. Could you try again? Siri, I'm not talking to you. What I'm trying to do is go very deep on one little portion. Stone. I want to take this very... Now, what's around it provides us clues. We're going to pick some of that up. But I want you to go with me. We're going to go deeper. We're going to look for stone. So far, we have a stone that is rejected by the builders. We have a stone which is tested, a rare stone. Okay? Now go with me to Isaiah chapter 8. I love how Siri picks up on, like she's going to help me. Isaiah 8, verse 14. Isaiah 8:14. "And he shall be for a sanctuary, but for a stone of stumbling and for a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel, for a trap and for a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And many among them shall stumble and fall and be broken and be snared and be taken." He will be for a sanctuary. Now in your notes as you work through this, you should have questions. Who will be for a sanctuary? I'm reminded of a passage in Ezekiel, but we can't get sidetracked. We're going deep on stone. This stone is a stone of offense, it's called. It's offensive. It's negef is the Hebrew word. It means like a stroke a strike or a plague. All right? Many shall stumble, it says, because of this stone. So now we have an Evan, a Roy Evan from Joseph. We have a stone which the builders rejected. We have a tested cornerstone, a rare stone, a stone of offense. Many shall stumble because of this. In Hebrew, remember this, kashal, to stumble. Now, with that in mind, go back to Isaiah 28. Isaiah 28. We're looking only at stone, and we're looking for identity clues. Isaiah 28. This time, I want you to look at verse 13. Earlier we looked at verse 16, which begins, "Therefore, thus says Adonai Jehovah, behold, I lay in Zion for a foundation, a stone, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone," and so forth. But verse 13 of 28 says this. Verse 13 says, "Therefore, the word of Jehovah was to them precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, here a little, there a little, that they might go and fall backward and be broken and snared and taken." Now, where have I heard that language before? And then there's a white space. Now, how many of you have ever heard teachers of the Bible talk about the great method whereby study should be done? Line upon line, precept upon precept, and they go through that like that's a good thing. You need to read context. What this is talking about is a trap. Ultimately, what this is talking about, it's going to be something in this context which causes the falling, the breaking, the being captivated, snared, and taken. Now, by the way, where it says fall backwards, the Hebrew word there means it's kashal. Now, that's the same word that we just saw earlier when it says many shall stumble. So, my point being that we have to look for clues. So if you go from Psalm 118 and we have this information about a stone which is rejected by the builders, you get into this next one and it talks about the testing of the stone, the stricken and the falling, and all of these things begin to describe what many have believed is the identity of a coming redemptive figure, the stone. Now go with me to the book of Daniel. Go to Daniel and let's look at Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2 and verse 34. Daniel 2:34. "As you did look, a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon its feet, which were of iron and clay, and broke them to pieces." Now we have a stone pictured in the book of Daniel. Now the question is this stone related to the other references? Does this stone speak of a coming figure? Now, you have to look at it in context. So let's begin in verse 31 at the white space of chapter 2 in Daniel, just to pick up a little bit more breadth in this idea of the stone, and then we'll move forward. It says in verse 31, Daniel 2, "Thou, O king, did see and behold a great image. This image, which was mighty and whose brightness was surpassing, stood before you, and its form was terrible. The image's head was of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly, its thighs of brass, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you did look, a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon its feet, which were of iron and clay, and broke them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, the gold, broken in pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, so that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This is the dream. We will state its meaning before the king. Now the question is, there's certainly indication of some breaking going on. Now, is this in any way something which therefore must connect in Isaiah 28 about the breaking and so forth? You see, we're talking about a stone. It's associated with the breaking, in this case, of a great image. Very interesting. We have to keep going. Now, go with me to verse 44 of Daniel chapter. By the way, let me make this point. In verse 36, let's look at verse 36 first. This is the dream. We will state its meaning before the king. Just like we did in Daniel 7, here we have an interpretation which follows. And the question becomes, should we pay attention to this interpretation or no? Only if we want to know what it means. So my point being that before we get too crazy with our understanding of what the image is and what is that particularly talking about, we have to at least consider that Daniel says here, oh, by the way, here's the interpretation. Because I know people who will get kind of crazy into their interpretation. You go, well, that's not what it says it means. Yeah, I know, but so we don't want to do that. But I want to move forward. Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44. And in the days of these kings, now this is part of the interpretation, shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to another people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it will stand forever, just as you did see that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold. The great God is made known to the king. What shall come to pass hereafter? The dream is certain and the meaning of it sure. Question. If the stone in Daniel 2, verse 31 through 35, is one which shall destroy these other kingdoms, and if we learn that the stone represents not an individual, but another kingdom which Jehovah will rise up, have we not begun to see perhaps the meaning of this text? So the question is the stone which the builders rejected, is that the kingdom or is it an individual? Is the tested stone a people, a kingdom, or is it an individual? We have to consider these things. Just like in Daniel chapter 7, I beheld in a vision of the night, and one like unto the Son of Man was brought before the Ancient of Days. And everybody says, oh, he's on the clouds of heaven. It's the Messiah. But does the text indicate that the vision is really of a coming kingdom? So what if these texts about the one coming on the clouds, the Son of Man, is actually about the kingdom of Israel, which has been tested and which has been tried and which has come through and which is ultimately to be a surprise and a shock to the people of the world? What if the stone is another way of describing this kingdom which, let's see how it puts it, in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, will not be left to another people, but shall break into pieces. You see? So we have to wonder, a lot of people will look at this and say, oh, the stone, that's the Messiah. But we're not finished with the stone. Let's go to Zechariah chapter 3. The prophet Zechariah chapter 3 and verse 9. Zechariah 3:9. And I just want to read this one verse. For behold, the stone that I've laid before Joshua, upon one stone, now I'm going to read the English first, are 7 facets. Behold, meaning faces. Behold, I will engrave its inscription, says Jehovah of hosts, and I will remove the iniquity of that land in one day. Now in Hebrew, it says, Ki hinei ha'even asher natati lifnei Yehoshua. He says, I will, because behold the stone which I am putting before Joshua, upon a stone, achat, upon one stone, al even achat, 7 pairs of eyes. That's what it says. The word for eye is in the dual. So he says, upon one stone, al even achat, 7 pairs of eyes. What does that mean? We have to look at this and we have to consider, is there anything in this passage, in the surrounding verbiage, that can give us a clue? Who, if anyone is, if it's a who is the stone and who are the 7 pairs of eyes? Are these individuals throughout history? There's several ways we can look at this. Now, we haven't read the entire section. Perhaps there's something else around the stone with 7 pairs of eyes that we can discern a little bit more to go on. For instance, let's look at verse 10. Let's see if that helps us. By the way, it does. On that day, says Jehovah of hosts, every one of you shall invite his neighbor to come under his vine and under his fig tree. Okay, that sounds familiar, Ross. Where have you heard that phrase? What I want to do is I want to get a little more context around the stone with 7 pairs of eyes, the manifestation of which takes place in a single day in which the iniquity will be removed. You see, I'm not stretching things here. I'm not adding to or taking away from. So if I want to say, what day is that? You know, because it says very clearly in verse 9, I will remove the iniquity of that land in one day. Your question should be, well, what day is that, Lord? Well, let's keep reading. On that day, says Jehovah of hosts, every one of you will invite his neighbor to come under his vine and under his fig tree. So what people then should say is, where have I seen that? Micah 4, right? Go with me to the book of Micah. Micah chapter 4. And we'll get a little bit more information about that day and possibly, maybe, a little context around the coming or the manifestation of a stone with 7 pairs of eyes. People often associate the 7 pairs of eyes with the 7 spirits which are before the throne in Isaiah chapter 6. Could that be? Maybe. Maybe we'll look at that later. Micah 4, verse 1. But in the last days, Bahaya ba'akarit hayamim, and it will be in the last days that the mountain of the house of Jehovah shall be established on top of the mountains. It shall be exalted above the hills. People shall stream towards it. And many nations shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of Jehovah, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For Torah shall go forth from Zion. Now remember, Zion occurs in the laying of the tested stone in Isaiah 28. Go forth from Zion, and the word of Jehovah from Jerusalem. He shall judge between many people and decide concerning strong nations far off. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up a sword against nation, nor shall they learn war any more. But they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. For the mouth of Jehovah of hosts has spoken it. But let all people walk every one in the name of his God, and we will walk in the name of our God, Jehovah, forever and ever. Now, the reason that I brought this in is because in the passage in Zechariah 3:9, there was an interesting reference that said that around the time of the manifestation or the revelation of the stone with 7 pairs of eyes, the iniquity of the land would be removed in one day, and in that day, people would be sitting under their vine and under their fig tree. What this passage does is it connects to Zechariah or to Micah chapter 4, which also mentions the sitting under the vine and under the fig tree. So it gives us a little more context. So when I'm now studying, just to make the point, when I'm looking at Zechariah 3, I can now perhaps associate the things that are being described there with what Micah 4 is describing. Now, perhaps I want to find more. Isaiah chapter 2 describes in very similar words what Micah 4 says here, but with significant differences. One, you have Isaiah and Micah are shown the same vision. One of the prophets, we're not going to do this today, I'm just going to touch on it. One of the prophets looks and he says, many Gentiles are coming. Another prophet sees the same group and says, I'm not going to call them Goyim. I don't know if they're Gentiles. He says, I see many people streaming to it. Amim. So is it Gentiles or is it people? Or looking at them, perhaps they look like Gentiles. But maybe they're not Gentiles. Maybe they just appear to be Gentiles. Perhaps they're the return of the tribes. You see how we can begin to build? So if I read Isaiah 2 and Micah 4 side by side and note every difference, those differences are important because they give us more detail that help us flesh out the story. Now, go back to Zechariah chapter 3. We didn't finish with Zechariah 3. In Zechariah 3, this time, I want to look at verse 8. Hear now, O Yehoshua, the high priest, you and your fellows who sit before you, for they are men of good name. For behold, I will bring my servant, the branch. Now, Hebrew is zemach, but in your translation, if you have an English Bible, a lot of times they'll even have branch capitalized. That's his name, branch. I'll bring my servant branch. Who is the branch? In Zechariah chapter 3, verse 8, part B, it says, Ki hini mevi et avdi tzemach. Behold, because behold, I am bringing my servant tzemach. Now the Hebrew doesn't have a capital B. in the text here. So we have to ask ourselves, is it to be translated as branch, like that's going to give us the clue, or is the one who is coming the servant of Jehovah, based on the text, is the servant known as Tzemach? Like that's his name. Could be. So we have to look at this. Is it a name or a title? So let's look, while we're in Zechariah, at chapter 6. We're looking now at branch. See how I branched off a stone? Now I'm into branch. This is how quickly this goes. Chapter 6, verse 12. Thus speaks Jehovah of hosts, saying, Behold, a man whose name is Tzemach, and who shall stand or grow up out of his place, and he shall build the temple of Jehovah. He shall build the temple of Jehovah, and he shall bear the glory, and shall sit and rule upon his throne. Now this goes on with more detail. But here, just a couple of chapters later, we were introduced in Zechariah 3:8 to the branch which is coming. And now, in 6:12, we get that this is the name of someone who's coming, who will build the temple. Let's look at a couple more passages on Tzemach. Tzemach, let's go to Isaiah 4. I know that if you're just following through with me, these points are very difficult to follow, but I want to demonstrate as best I can, just going through verses, the complexity and the vast amount of pulling together that has to take place in order to solve the riddle, to come up with the solution. You know, you're best if you build this on paper, you know, with pen and pad. But so this has got to work. Just bear with me. Isaiah 4:2. In that day, B'yom hahu, in that day shall the plant of Jehovah. Now in Hebrew it's Tzemach. The plant of Jehovah be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall be excellent and comely for them that are escaped of Israel. So what does Tzemach mean there? Zechariah 6:12 clearly indicates that Tzemach in Zechariah appears to be a person who will build the temple, right? But he's not called the Messiah. You notice none of these passages have said a single word mention of Messiah. We've seen a shepherd, we've seen a stone, the shepherd from Beit Lechem Ephratah, a rejected stone, a sure stone, a tested stone. None of that mentions anything about Messiah. Tzemach, 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 no mention of Messiah. We get a coming figure, a stone with 7 pairs of eyes, no mention of Messiah. I want to call Bible things by Bible names. When we look at Tzemach, what else is there? Go to Jeremiah chapter 23. Jeremiah 23, and let's just look at verse 5 and 6. These are broken out by white spaces. Jeremiah 23, verse 5. Behold, days are coming, says Jehovah, when I will raise to David a righteous offshoot, and he shall reign as a king and prosper, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the earth. In his days Judah shall be saved, and Israel shall dwell safely. And this is his name whereby he will be called, Yehovah Tzidkenu. Now this is talking where it says to David, a righteous branch. It's Tzemach Sadiq. a branch of righteousness. Here, it's not a name as much as it's used to describe. It's a righteous branch. Now, you could say, perhaps, because this is a righteous branch, his name will be called branch. You know, because names in the Bible have meaning. So when this one comes who is to be a descendant of David, who is to reign on a throne, and he is coming, he is the promised one. Notice this matches because the verse we just read in Zechariah says he's going to build the temple and so forth. Well, this person here is going to reign as king. You have to compare the two and put these two together. This person here, he's going to be a righteous branch. Notice, and the name, his name, whereby he will be called. You go, hey, Tzamak, Yehovah Tzidkenu. That's like his name. He's like branch, Jehovah our righteousness. It's a nice name. The name whereby he will be called. Okay, go with me to Jeremiah 33. Jeremiah 33. Jeremiah gets another glimpse at this. The way I imagine this happened, Jeremiah gets the vision. He records Jeremiah 23, verse 5 and 6. What does he see? He sees a righteous branch of David known as Jehovah Tzidkenu. He's later shown the same vision, but with more detail perhaps. Look at Jeremiah 33, verse 14. But again, we're going to read what's set off by white spaces. Behold, days are coming, says Jehovah, when I will perform that good thing which I have promised to the house of Israel and to the house of Judah. In those days and at that time I will cause an offshoot of righteousness, which is Tzamak Tzedakah, offshoot of righteousness, to grow up for David, and he will execute justice and righteousness in the land. In those days shall Judah be saved, and Jerusalem shall dwell safely, and this is the name whereby she shall be called, namely Yehovah Tzidkenu. Now we have some interesting filling out of the details. You see how this works better if you take a pen and pad? All of you today, I want you to just spend the rest of the day. Shut the TV off, don't do anything, but look at these texts we're covering today and write it. You say, well, I can just read it. No, write it. This is the way you learn. You must put pen to paper. I want you to take Jeremiah 23, verse 5 and 6, and write it very neatly, line by line. I want you to take Jeremiah 33, verse 14, 16, and write it out. And then take highlighters or pencils, colored pencils, and underline points of similarity, and also with another color, indicate areas that are different. Here's one for you. Notice that in Jeremiah 23, the name of the righteous branch for David is Yehovah Tzidkenu. But in Jeremiah 33, that's not the name of the righteous branch. It's the name he will call, what, Jerusalem maybe? The name whereby she, see, notice, this is the name whereby she shall be called, namely Jehovah our righteousness. So now we've got, I assume this is, based on what I understand it to be, quite possibly the city of Jerusalem is called Jehovah our righteousness. Okay. Now, if I were studying the branch, I might be led to put The passages that I just covered in Zechariah 3:8, Zechariah 6:12, Isaiah chapter 4, verse 2, Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 5 and 6, and Jeremiah 33, verse 14, 16, Tzemach, the branch, I might be led to associate them with Isaiah chapter 11 and verse 1, which also speaks of a branch. Look with me at Isaiah 11 and verse 1. Hopefully everyone is okay with this sort of a study today. I'm hoping to bring people into a place where we can really get into the details. Isaiah 11:1, it says, "And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Yishai," or Jesse, "and a branch shall grow out of his roots, and the Spirit of the Lord Jehovah shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of fear of Jehovah, and his delight shall be in the fear of Jehovah," and so forth and so on. It goes on and on. But if I want to look particularly at branch, I can't see you. You can see me. How many of you look at your Bible and see the word branch? Some translations do this differently, but many have the word branch, and would therefore say, the branch of Jeremiah 23, Jeremiah 33, the branch of Zechariah 3:8. Here he is again in Isaiah chapter 11. But in Isaiah 11, it's a different word. In Isaiah 11, you remember a couple of weeks ago I talked about this interesting feature in Hebraic studies called parallelism, where you have two component parts of a verse which complement one the other. So let me share this with you. So in part A of 11:1, it says, "A shoot will go forth from the stump of Jesse," or the stem of Jesse. A shoot, a choter, will go forth from the stem of Jesse. Then part B says, "A netzer from his roots will bear forth fruit." Now this is parallelism. So what we have to do is we have to stack these. I can see now I'm going to have to start using my dry erase board. But we have two complementary clues identifying the figure. Part A, top. You write, I want you to do this on paper, you write, "Shoot, go forth from stump of Jesse." You just want component parts. That's part A. A shoot will go forth from the stump of Jesse, part A. Part B is, "A netzer will bear fruit from his roots." So if you write this as I just described it, you're going to have the shoot, the choter, is the netzer. Does that make sense? Both of these are describing in different words the same figure. The shoot, who will bear fruit, who will go forth from the stump of Jesse, is the same as the netzer, who will bear forth from fruit from his roots. So you look at that in that way. The netzer is the choter. Those two go together. Isaiah uses this particular word, netzer, a lot. Now, a lot of people miss this, but if you look at the Hebrew and you do a search for netzer, which means a netzer is really, it's tied to the root idea of keep. Keep. Now, I want you to look with me. I'm going to go through a couple of passages in Isaiah that use this word. Isaiah 42, verse 6. "I, Jehovah, have called you in righteousness and will hold your hand and will keep you." I will keep you. This particular word in Hebrew is I will netzer, basically. So you say, who is the netzer? Well, in this case, We have to look at the context. Again, I'm not saying that every time this word appears, it's defining our figure. In this case, I'm just hitting a couple of points of the use from Isaiah. Look at chapter 48, verse 6. Isaiah 48, verse 6 says this, you have heard, now see all this, and will you not declare it? I have shown you new things from this time, hidden things which you did not know. They are created now, not from the beginning. I must have wrote down the wrong verse, forgive me. Let's see. I won't look very long for it. Okay, look with me at Isaiah, let's see if 49, 6 is where I was looking for. Isaiah 49, 6, yeah. And he said, is it too light a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Israel and to restore the preserved of Israel? I will also give you for a light of the nations, at my salvation to the end of the earth. So somehow now, whoever the servant is of Isaiah, assuming that there's only one, which there's not, by the way, but this servant, it's his job to bring back the servant. The servant Jacob is to be brought back by this servant. Notice very clearly that this has to do with the idea of Netzer. Now, we can't always associate Netzer with a positive figure of Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1, just to show you how the plot thickens. Look with me at Isaiah 14. Isaiah 14. Now, this passage is often associated with the devil, right? In my early Christian days, in my study Bible, I think in the Dakes, Isaiah chapter 14 and Ezekiel 28 describe the devil, Satan, and how he was a beautiful angel and used to sing really nice and lead the heavenly choir and rebelled up and got cast out and thrown. Remember all that? Okay, that's not biblical. None of that's in the Bible. But anyway, it was a good story, scared the hell out of kids. Isaiah 14, verse 29, though, Isaiah 14, 19. This is talking about the figure of Isaiah 14, not the devil, but you are cast out of your grave like an abhorred branch, dressed in the garment of the slain, thrust through with a sword like them that go down to the stones of the pit as a carcass trodden under feet. You shall not be joined with them in burial, because you've destroyed your land, slain your people. May the seed of evildoers nevermore be named, and so forth. This branch is an abominable branch. Now, side note, as I roll towards the end of the class today. Years ago, I was looking in my Hebraic studies of the Gospels, talking a long time ago, and Hugh Schoenfield has the Gospel according to the Hebrews. And in this work, he shows whether this is ancient or late, but it's a polemical argument between believers in Jesus of Nazareth and some of his opponents. All of these people are Jews. They're both Jewish groups, but they're arguing over the validity of Yeshua being the Messiah. And in one of these disputes, this polemical back and forth, the believers in Yeshua said, our guy is the branch. For it says, a branch shall grow forth from his, he quotes Isaiah 11. The opponent says, oh yeah, your guy's the branch, all right. The abhorred branch, which is cast forth from the grave. Now I bring that up because you have to be careful when you associate certain text with the identity of your figure. Could be your figure, but if you're not careful, you associate certain things that you don't want to associate with your redemptive figure. I'll give you a classic example. Many Christian study Bibles will take Zechariah 13, a passage that refers to what are these wounds in your hands, you know, and they'll take that and they'll go, look, it's talking about Jesus. And you're like, hey, look, if you're a Jesus person, you don't want that text because that text is talking about a false prophet. Zechariah 13, go read it. So in other words, there are texts within text which pile upon one another. We have to be very concerted in our effort to focus on details matter. Details matter. Whenever we look at the stone, we can consider all references to stone, but you know, some of these references really do talk about rocks. Some of these references might just be poetic, but some of these might provide clues as to the identity of a coming figure. Will a figure, redemptive figure, come from Joseph, who is referred to as the Roe Evan? Misham, from Joseph, Roe Evan. Will this stone be rejected by the builders? Will this stone be tested and tried? Will this stone have the 7 pairs of eyes upon it? You see how these things begin to build and you can begin to draw a portrait. Now, what we don't want to do is insinuate that the texts are saying something they're not, but we must take careful notes and begin to identify as best we can with everything that we have to identify the details about these particular prophets. So your exercise today, or if you don't want to do it today, do it sometime in the next week, is to write Jeremiah 20. If you can do Hebrew, that's even better, but just do English, it's fine. Do Jeremiah 23, 5, and 6. Take a paper and draw a line down the middle of it and use one side to do Jeremiah 23, 5, and 6, the other to do Jeremiah 33, 14 through 16, and just draw out. Look at the differences. Look at Isaiah 2 versus Micah 4. You're going to see what I'm explaining in great detail. The quest to understand the prophets must be planted firmly in their words. We have to be careful in our associations and base on the words, in connection with the words, and on the basis of the words, all that we come out with. We need to call Bible things by Bible names. If the figure is being described and he is called Branch, let's call him Branch. Let's not call him the Messiah. If your theology is hung up on the Messiah or a Messiah, then do your altar call and say, how many of you would like to accept the branch into your heart? You know, call the subject according to the way the Bible calls it. That's what we need to do. It's the first, it's foundational. If we don't get the name right, we're going to have problems as we get into more detail. Our connections must be based on textual clues, and where possible, we need to look at the Hebrew. Next week, we will resume our search for more clues as to the identity of our redemptive figure, or the series of redemptive figures that we've begun to uncover, if you will. So in class 11, our series on the prophets will continue to search for the identity of these redemptive figures. So have a beautiful week. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov. Thanks for joining me.